cameras were live when the elderly man pulled out a letter and Johnny Carson froze because that letter was from 1944. It was March 1976. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Studio 6B at NBC in Burbank. Another Thursday night. Another monologue about politics and celebrities. Another 300 people in the audience expecting laughs and light conversation and maybe a musical performance from Doc Severinsen's band. Everything was routine. Everything was safe. Everything was exactly what America expected at 11:30 p.m. Until the old man in the third row stood up during the commercial break and asked if he could speak to Johnny. The audience coordinator had tried to stop him. "Sir, you can't just approach Mr. Carson. There are protocols." But something about the way the man stood, ramrod straight despite his 82 years, hands trembling slightly, eyes wet with unshed tears, made the coordinator pause. "Please," the old man said. "I've waited 40 years for this. Just 1 minute. That's all I need." Johnny was reviewing his cue cards for the next segment when he noticed the commotion. He looked up, saw the elderly man being gently restrained by studio staff, and raised his hand. "Let him through," Johnny said. The man walked slowly to the edge of the stage. Up close, Johnny could see the details. The worn but carefully maintained suit, the American flag lapel pin, the liver spots on weathered hands, the way he moved like someone whose body had been through hell but whose spirit refused to bend. "Mr. Carson," the man said, his voice surprisingly strong. "My name is Robert Mitchell. I'm a World War II veteran. Normandy. Market Garden. Battle of the Bulge." He paused, composing himself. "I need to tell you why I came to your show tonight." Johnny glanced at the cameras. Still in commercial. Maybe 90 seconds before they were live again. But something in Robert Mitchell's eyes told him this couldn't wait. "Tell me," Johnny said simply. Robert reached into his jacket pocket with shaking hands and pulled out an envelope. Old. Yellowed with age. The edges worn soft from being handled countless times over decades. "This letter," Robert said, "was written by your father, John William Carson, in 1944, in France. And it saved my life." Carson stopped mid-preparation. The entire studio froze. The commercial break ended. The cameras went live. Johnny wasn't at his desk. He was standing at the edge of the stage, staring at an old man holding a letter that couldn't possibly exist. Ed McMahon, sensing something was wrong, leaned forward. "Johnny? We're back. You want me to?" Johnny held up one hand without looking away from Robert Mitchell. "No. Everyone needs to hear this." The audience fell silent. The band lowered their instruments. Doc Severinsen looked at his musicians and shook his head slightly. "Don't play, something's happening." Johnny's voice was steady but quiet. "You said my father wrote that letter?" "Yes, sir. My father was never in World War II. He was exempt. Rural electrification work. Essential civilian service." Robert Mitchell smiled sadly. "That's what you were told. And it's mostly true. But for 6 months in 1944, your father volunteered for a special program. Civilians with electrical expertise, sent to Europe to help restore power infrastructure behind advancing lines. It was classified. Most of the men never told their families." Johnny's hands gripped the edge of the stage. I never knew. He wasn't supposed to tell you. But he was there, Mr. Carson. November 1944. A small French village called Vuziers. The Germans had destroyed the power station before retreating. Your father was part of a four-man team sent to get it running again so field hospitals could operate. Robert's voice cracked slightly. "I was a corporal. 21 years old. I'd been fighting since D-Day. I'd seen things." He stopped, steadied himself. "I'd seen too much. Lost too many friends. By November, I was done. Not physically. Mentally. I couldn't do it anymore." The studio was absolutely silent. 300 people barely breathing. I was going to desert. Robert continued. I'd made up my mind. There was a farmhouse outside the village. I was going to hide there until the war moved past me. I didn't care about court-martial or firing squad or anything. I couldn't fight anymore. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Johnny climbed onto the stage. Not toward his desk. Toward Robert Mitchell. He crossed the distance and stood directly in front of the old veteran. What happened? Johnny asked softly. Your father found me, Robert said. I was sitting in that farmhouse, alone, my rifle on the floor, trying to work up the courage to just end it. And this civilian walked in. Older guy, maybe 45, wearing work clothes covered in grease and mud. He had a toolbox and a flashlight and the most tired eyes I'd ever seen. Robert clutched the letter tighter. He sat down next to me. Didn't say anything about my rifle being on the ground or the fact that I was clearly AWOL. He just sat there for maybe 10 minutes. Then he started talking. What did he say? He told me about his son. About a boy back in Iowa who was smart and funny and wanted to be a magician. He said his son wrote him letters asking about the war, and he never knew what to write back because how do you explain this to a kid? How do you make sense of it? Johnny's jaw clenched. His father had never mentioned this. Never once in all the years before he died in 1963 had John William Carson told his son he'd been to Europe during the war. Your father told me, Robert continued, that his son gave him hope. That knowing there was a world back home where kids still wanted to do magic tricks and make people laugh, that kept him going through the bad days. He said his son reminded him that this war wasn't the whole world. That there was still beauty and humor and possibility. Robert held up the letter. Then he wrote this. Right there in that farmhouse. By flashlight. And he handed it to me. What does it say? Johnny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert unfolded the letter with shaking hands. The paper crackled softly. Decades of being carefully stored and periodically removed to be read again. He cleared his throat. It says, Corporal Mitchell, I don't know what you're going through. I can't imagine it. But I know my son Johnny is back home believing the world is full of good people doing good things. And I need you to help me prove him right. I need you to survive this war and go home and be one of those good people. Because if men like you give up, then the world really does belong to the darkness. And my son deserves better than that. We all do. Please don't quit. Not today. Not here. Go back. Finish this. Then go home and make him right about the world. The letter trembled in Robert's hands. Johnny reached out and steadied them, his own hands shaking too. Your father walked me back to my unit, Robert said, tears streaming freely down his weathered face. He didn't report me. He just walked with me through the dark and talked about Iowa and his son who wanted to be a magician. I went back. I fought. I survived. I made it home. Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny took the letter from Robert's hands. He looked at the yellowed paper, at his father's handwriting, familiar even after all these years, though he'd never seen these particular words before. He looked at the cameras. At Ed McMahon, who was openly crying. At Doc Severinsen, who had set his trumpet down and was wiping his eyes. At the audience, silent and spellbound. Ladies and gentlemen, Johnny said, his voice thick with emotion. This is going to sound strange, but I need to read you this letter. All of it. Because my father never told me he did this. And I think... He stopped, composed himself. I think maybe this is why I do what I do. He read the letter aloud. Every word. His father's handwriting shaky from cold and exhaustion, the sentiments simple but profound. A civilian electrician trying to save a broken soldier by talking about his son back home who still believed in magic. When Johnny finished, he carefully folded the letter and handed it back to Robert. Why now? He asked. Why come tell me this after all these years? Robert smiled through his tears. Because last month, my grandson told me he wants to be a comedian. Wants to make people laugh like you do. And I realized, your father gave me back my life so I could have a family. So I could have a grandson. And now that grandson wants to follow in your footsteps. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a photograph. A young man, maybe 20, with bright eyes and a wide smile. This is Thomas. And I wanted to tell you that your father's belief in good people, it echoed forward. Through me. Through my son. Through Thomas. Your father saved me, and I've spent 40 years trying to be the good person he believed I could be. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Johnny looked at the photograph. At this young man who existed because his father had walked into a farmhouse in France 32 years ago and refused to let a broken soldier give up. He looked at Robert Mitchell. At 82 years old, standing straight, wearing his flag pin with pride, having traveled from Oregon to California just to say thank you to the son of a man who had been dead for 13 years. Johnny made a decision. Robert, he said, would you stay for the rest of the show? As my guest? Not in the audience. Here. On stage. With me. Robert's eyes widened. Mr. Carson, I couldn't. Please. I'm asking. Johnny turned to his producers in the wings. Get another chair. Put it next to my desk. Mr. Mitchell is going to sit with me tonight. The audience erupted in applause. Not the usual Tonight Show applause. Something deeper. Cathartic. The sound of 300 people witnessing something that transcended television. A stagehand brought out a chair. Johnny helped Robert onto the stage, the old veteran moving carefully but with dignity. They sat together behind Johnny's desk, and for the next 40 minutes, Johnny Carson didn't do his show. He just talked with Robert Mitchell. About the war. About his father. About Thomas, the grandson who wanted to make people laugh. About how ripples of kindness echo forward through time in ways we never see. Ed McMahon barely spoke. He just listened, occasionally wiping tears. The band played soft, gentle music between segments. The scheduled celebrity guests were quietly told they'd be rescheduled. Near the end of the show, Johnny asked Robert if he still had the letter. Always, Robert said, patting his jacket. I've carried it for 32 years. It's been with me through everything, my wedding, the birth of my children, every major moment of my life. When things got hard, I'd read it and remembered that someone believed I could be good. Johnny was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his own desk drawer and pulled out a fountain pen. An expensive one, clearly meaningful. My father gave me this pen when I got the Tonight Show job. He said, write your own future, son. I never understood why he chose those specific words. He held the pen, turning it slowly in his hands. But now I think I do. He knew what words could do. He knew that what you write down, what you say to someone in their darkest moment, it can change everything. Johnny looked directly at the camera. At America watching. My father, John Carson, was just a power company manager from Iowa. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a hero by any traditional measure. But he went to France in 1944 and he wrote words that saved a man's life. And that man went home and built a family and raised a son who raised a grandson who wants to make people laugh. His voice broke slightly. And I never knew. He never told me. He just came home and went back to work and raised his family and died without ever mentioning that he'd done something that mattered this much. Robert placed his hand on Johnny's shoulder. He told you in other ways, Mr. Carson. Every night you make millions of people laugh. You're doing what he did in that farmhouse. You're reminding people the world isn't just darkness. You're giving them hope. You're your father's son. The audience rose to their feet. Standing ovation. Not for comedy. Not for entertainment. For witnessing the moment when a son understood his father's legacy. Johnny stood and embraced Robert Mitchell. Two men, connected across decades by a letter written in wartime, holding each other while America watched. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the show, Johnny had the letter professionally preserved. He kept it in a special display case in his office for the rest of his career. Next to it, he placed the fountain pen his father had given him. When Johnny Carson did his final Tonight Show broadcast in 1992, Robert Mitchell, now 98 years old, was in the audience. Johnny pointed to him during his closing remarks and said simply, "That man taught me why this job matters." The letter and the pen are now in the Smithsonian. The exhibit plaque reads, "Words that echo, how one letter in 1944 changed television forever." Robert Mitchell lived to be 101. His grandson Thomas became a comedy writer. He works in television. He makes people laugh. And every time he writes a joke, he thinks about his grandfather and a man named John Carson who believed in goodness when the world was dark.